want to begin my remarks this evening by reminding you that at one time uh, there was a world in which we lived in which the wearing of masks was just something we did once a year at Purim. In fact, the rabbis understood this day of Yom Kippur as a day Kippurim, a day in which for one day we removed the masks and stood in all of our spiritual nakedness before the Eternal One and acknowledged that for one day we could be pious people. For one day we could drop the pretense of not being pious and practice piety. So it was called a day like Purim, in which it was customary actually to wear masks where it was permissible to be other than what we were. This period of time in our collective life in the United States and throughout the world has been a time where many of the masks of civility, of many of the masks of relationships around human rights, many of the masks of what we call fair practice, even law, were rare. The masks in our society have come off. And we are faced with a profound recognition that we are at another crossroads. I love to quote Leo Beck, who I quoted at Rosh Hashanah, for those of you who missed it. Leo Beck's profound statement in 1933, "We Jews view the world through ancient eyes." And indeed, tonight, as we observe not only our polity, but that of other countries, we are forced to come face to face with removing the masks of pretense, the assumptions that somehow our society, its institutions, would function properly. We are, and everyone has found this at a different moment, at the edge of the abyss. I'm normally not the preacher of calamity. I'm normally not the preacher of apocalypse. By the way, my 7-year-old grandson has taken all the big words that I use, like apocalypse, and he has translated them into his language. So when I use the word apocalypse describing the terrible fires up north, he said, "Cockroaches at the Olympics?" So indeed, we are in a moment of great terror. There have been other times in Jewish history where we've faced these kinds of very serious events. The rabbis were not shy in describing the destruction of the temple as the result of the sin of silence. A man named Kamsa gave a party, and accidentally the invitations went out. He invited somebody who was not his friend. His name was Bar Kamsa, and Bar Kamsa, mistakenly thinking that this was a gesture of reconciliation, went to the party. And Mr. Kamsa comes up to him and says, "Please leave." And there develops a public scene. And for the rabbis, the details of the public scene include the fact that Bar Kamsa, the uninvited or mistakenly invited guest, offers to pay for the entire party, not to be thrown out and shamed. And yes, shaming is a big part of what has transpired in our society. But for the rabbis, the real question was that no one intervened. In fact, it doesn't say no one intervened, it says that the rabbis didn't intervene. Whatever you think of rabbis, at one time they were supposed to be the guarantors of a certain fairness and moral authority. They were not supposed to be among the silent. They didn't speak up. And the story goes on and it develops with the fact that Bar Kamsa, greatly ashamed, greatly insulted, with no one taking his side, decides to set in motion things that led to, and I don't want to recount the whole story, the destruction of the Second Temple. And in the way that rabbis understand this unfolding of the whole process, it led to 2,000 years of exile. I could tell you a similar story about how at very critical moments in our society, there were times when even if people spoke up, they were not listened to. I can tell you a story about the politics of our society in which the small things became the bigger things. The wars that we have fought for dubious causes. The invention of reasons for going to war. And yes, the slippery slope that I would argue didn't begin with one administration or another, but has been a road on which we've been on for some time. It's not necessary to name names. Everyone knows what I'm talking about. But that has brought us to this moment. The moment for me that was the greatest heartbreak was not only the hypocrisy of the current process set in motion to appoint a Supreme Court justice, but that was just the last straw. Maybe there will be more. Some of them point to the invalidation of the entire election process, perhaps throwing it into the House of Representatives for a decision that would be profoundly the result of the minority coming to rule the majority. I don't think it's my job to lay out these scenarios, but I do think it's my job as one of the people that enlisted in this army of rabbis that began some 2,000 years ago, not to be silent. And in fact, from a democratic perspective, I would argue that none of us can be silent. Because silence, and here I quote Elie Wiesel, neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Or Martin Luther King's quote when he was protesting the Vietnam War. It's actually a quote from invoking Dante. The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in the period of moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. And he went on to say, I cannot be a silent onlooker while evil rages, while evil rages. There's a contrast that I think we should consider. We spoke of the passing of Justice Ginsburg. In an interview that she gave to Forward magazine some 4 or 5 years ago, she spoke of the fact that it was the Holocaust that gave the boost to the important civil achievements that have happened in our society and in the world. There was no universal declaration of the rights of, in that time, man. The achievements of the UN with its charters were not available. The black soldiers, many of whom were the liberators of the camps in Europe, came home with a profound understanding that they could not come home to the same society that they had left. The many minority soldiers, Jews among them, who in a sense fought a double front war. Jews, I now have counted in my own life, having met and spoken to or heard about some 30 navigators of US planes, all Jews. And I asked them, so you were the navigator, anything about your Judaism that arose? And they would all, to a man, describe the fact that they fought a two-front war. Yes, they fought a war against the Germans or Japan, but inside the plane, they fought a war against the hate and the discrimination and disdain of people who hated them. Say that about the Japanese soldiers who were citizens of our country, whose parents were interred, and they had the same experience. Or the blacks, or the code readers that were so crucial. Every one of these minorities fought a true front war. But when they came back from World War II, they set in something in motion that is now threatened and perhaps about to be obliterated by this current moment in our society. So what does this have to do with Judaism? And what does this have to do with our responsibilities on Yom Kippur? I would argue that the important part of our prayer is not just the private getting right with our friends, which is very important. And it's not just the opportunities to reflect on the eternal teachings of Judaism, but it is to hear those eternal teachings in a way that sometimes is obliterated in this very wordy liturgy. I quote for you from tomorrow's Haftorah. This is the fast I desire, says the prophet Isaiah, to unlock fetters of wickedness and unite the cords and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. Politics. Again, politics. I would remind you that today we praise the rabbis who opposed slavery and Jim Crow laws, but when they practiced their Judaism, they were often reviled by their congregations. Some of them live in the valley. I happen to know many of them that took great chances both in their presence during the civil rights activities and in the loss of jobs and the public shaming they went through. But today, they are heroes. Today, we hold them up as exemplars of what our community should have done, and in large measure did do, not just rabbis, but many of the people sitting even in front of their screens tonight, who, against the logic of the Jewish establishment and the American establishment, sought to bring about a different America. So I would argue that we do not have a passive response at this time. That Yom Kippur is about a girding up, if I must use those military terms, of our courage and our responsibility. Yes, tell everybody to vote, but yes, get on the phone and spend 3 or 4 hours a day, if you can, calling and seeking to make a difference. And if you have money, certainly money is important. I hope that we will not live through another year like the past one. I hope we will not live through another administration like the past one. The rise of anti-Semitism, the incessant racism, the anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment, the disdain for people, children, separated from their parents, the vigilantes of violence that kill with impunity and then walk through the streets of an American town and the police don't see them, or the organized violence that comes under police uniforms. When do we start? When do we understand that this oppression is just steps away from our door? I would say it's been haunting at our door as we look at the incredibly painful response where we've now reached more than 200,000 people who've died of what was an administrative and information blockage. Do you know that in Taiwan, an island of 23 million, they have suffered from coronavirus? 23 million people have lost 8 people. And we, the great America, debate about whether the scientists will speak or the politicians. This is the moment in which Yom Kippur reminds us that, yes, we've seen history with old eyes, but we are now commanded by the moment that is emblazoned across this banner that has to be held high. We have a responsibility. We have a need. And it will not only impact Jewish life, I'm happy for the Jews, but if we succeed, it will impact and make a better America for all parts of it, for all the different diversity that exists. I do also understand that if we succeed, we will have to think long and hard about the fact that we will have to build bridges of reconciliation with what appears to be some 35 to 40% of the population that doesn't see anything wrong, that sees the past 4 years as just fine. that process of reconciliation is something that must be handled with great care, because it's clear that many of these people are intent upon carrying on this fight. And so at the same time that we have to mobilize with righteous indignation, we need to also at the same time acknowledge our responsibilities to heal. One of the things I've been involved with are non-headline opportunities to talk with people I never thought I would talk with. Some of you know that I ran with a woman named Jane Hunter, the largest project that attempted to expose the rise of right-wing America. It's still, portions of it are still up. It's called JewsOnFirst.org. Many of the people who are here are people who used to receive a newsletter. For those of you who are young, and that's not too many, Jews on First is part of an old Abbott and Costello routine, which you'll have to find on the internet, which asks the question, who's on first? And Jane Hunter and I attempted to argue for 10, 15 years that Jews would stand on the First Amendment, which guaranteed freedom of religious expression, freedom of speech, the right of assembly, the possibility that people could protest their government. And we went out after the Christian right. We led the first organized efforts to ask, what does it mean that the National Day of Prayer, so-called, would be sponsored by the federal government? Perhaps rabbis, ministers, and so forth might get together and have a National Day of Prayer, but in the White House? No. I recall that because I am an old Jew now, and I have old eyes. And I remember, with the scars on my consciousness and on my body, the responsibilities we have to bring our liturgy out of the prayer book and into the ballot box, into the halls of justice, into the supreme halls of justice, and not simply political manipulation. We're going to be wearing masks. These masks are there as part of the same kind of thing that I'm talking about. A respect for the Zulat, a respect for the other. I don't know about you, but now when I see someone in a public place without a mask, I almost instinctively want to yell at them. Not going to be successful. But until we are a society that thinks of what it means to be with all our diversity, then we will be living Torah instead of simply hearing about Torah. I wish you a happy, healthy New Year, and vote. Shana Tova.